The Phantom Hand. My grandfather was a wonderful, kind, and hard-working man. His parents were first-generation Italian immigrants who worked hard to provide a better life for their children. My grandfather grew up on a farm, one his parents originally worked at and later purchased after the original owners passed on. As his parents aged, he took over more and more responsibilities on the farm until they eventually retired and passed the farm on to him. He loved his farm, and we loved visiting him and playing in the very same places he had played as a child. Grandpa was very guarded about one spot on the farm, though. A small barn on the edge of the property by the tree line, now vacant and decaying after years of abandonment. We assumed that was why we were strictly forbidden from going anywhere near this barn, as it was a potential hazard. It wasn't until we grew older that Grandpa told us the real story. The whole family gathered at Grandma and Grandpa's farm for Thanksgiving that year. All of us cousins, ranging in age from toddlers to late teens, were running around the farm as the last remaining Thanksgiving dishes were finishing up in the oven. My cousin, Bea, and I, now 16 and 17, found ourselves near the tree line at the back of the property, close to the old barn. It had been a source of intrigue and mystery our entire lives, and now that we were older, we decided we were responsible enough to stay out of harm's way, so a quick peek inside the forbidden barn would do no harm. We started making our way toward it, excited to finally see what the big deal was all about. As I reached to unlatch the barn door, I heard a commotion coming from the back porch of the farmhouse. There was Grandpa, sprinting off the back porch, yelling his head off and making his way across the property faster than I'd ever seen him move. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he asked us when he finally reached us. We explained our reasoning, and he explained that the condition of the barn was not what made it a danger. He walked us back up to the farmhouse, took us into a quiet guest room away from the younger children, and finally explained why that particular barn should be avoided at all costs. Back when Grandpa's parents were just working on the farm, a young farmhand had worked later than usual one fall evening to finish a carpentry project that needed to be completed by the following morning. At the time, the barn at the back of the property housed a lot of tools and farm equipment, and had a room that served as a workshop. The next morning, the farmer noticed the barn doors had never been closed the previous evening and went to investigate. He found the young man dead just outside the doors to the workshop. He was only 21 years old. No one knows for sure what happened, but it appeared that the young man had suffered an accident in which he lost his hand, and in his panic and haste to leave the barn and find help, he had tripped and impaled himself on a tool just outside the workshop door. The young man was laid to rest in the coming days, but strangely, they were never able to find the hand that he had lost. The farmer chalked this up to wildlife, as the barn doors had been open all night, and anything could have come and gone during the hours the body laid there. Grandpa was a young child when this incident occurred. As years went on, more young farmhands came and went, none ever staying for long. Young men that went into the barn would come running out terrified and refuse to go back. There were several minor accidents in which farmhands were injured, but thankfully none as seriously as the first. They all swore up and down that something had caused them to trip, resulting in their accidents. This scared Grandpa a lot as a boy, but as he grew older and began helping with small tasks on the farm, he reasoned that the men were just spooked by the stories that had surrounded the farm since the initial accident. By his late teens, he was visiting that barn daily to retrieve farm equipment and had never experienced anything out of the ordinary. He continued this routine for years, taking over the role that the hired farmhands continually ran from. Grandpa was a good worker, and the farmer appreciated him and his ability to reason through the things that had spooked others in the past. Grandpa had no idea what could possibly have spooked the others, and was certain that they had simply let their imaginations run away with them. Fast forward to the fall of the year Grandpa turned 21. Everyone on the farm was working around the clock to prepare for the harvest season. The sun was starting to set, and Grandpa still had to finish mucking the stalls in the calf barn. He headed to the barn on the back of the property to gather the right equipment and load a wagon with some fresh straw. As he moved about the barn, he stopped several times, thinking he heard movement from somewhere inside. Seeing nothing, he assumed it must be a critter that had found its way inside to escape the weather that was beginning to grow colder. He made his way over to the wall outside the workshop where farm tools were stored. As he approached the tool rack, he felt his foot catch on something, causing him to trip and fall directly into the rack of sharp metal instruments. Luckily, he managed to avoid any injury and pulled himself to a sitting position to gather himself. As he turned around to see what his foot had gotten stuck on, he saw a severed hand lying on the floor right where he had tripped. The hand looked gray in color, as if it had been there for some time. Grandpa was stunned, but still figured there must be some logical explanation for what had happened. He got to his feet, intending to get a closer look and get to the bottom of the situation. That's when the hand moved and started inching its way toward him at an alarmingly fast pace. Grandpa turned and grabbed a pitchfork from the wall behind him, jabbed it into the hand, and ran from the barn in a hurry. His dad was nearby and saw him running from the barn. He hurried over to see what was wrong. My grandpa explained what had happened, and he and his father ventured back into the barn together. The hand was gone, but the pitchfork remained in the middle of the floor, a small trail of blood leading to a nearby pile of straw. My grandpa, his father, and the farmer searched the whole barn, but found nothing, not even a rodent that Grandpa could have mistaken in his panic. The three men became convinced that the spirit of the young farmhand who died there was not at rest, and was targeting other young farmhands out of anger stemming from his tragic death. The farmer had a new barn built to take the old one's place, and from that day forward, no one set foot in the old barn again. My cousin and I laughed at first, thinking Grandpa was pulling our leg like he had always done when we were children. After all, what sane person would believe a story like that? Grandpa insisted he was serious, however, and told us the barn was entirely unsafe, especially at our age. He made us promise we wouldn't try to enter the barn ever again. We promised, and the three of us joined the rest of the family for Thanksgiving dinner. That was a few years ago. I'm 21 now, and still not sure what to make of Grandpa's story. Grandpa's been slowing down a bit, and I've been visiting more often to help around the farm. The old barn still lurks at the back of the property, unused and untouched for decades. I often ride by as I complete chores, and I'm tempted to take a peek inside and find out what Grandpa's really worried about. Couldn't hurt, right? Just one peek. It was the year 2000. Summer was coming to an end, and a new school year was fast approaching. My friend and I, both 8-year-old girls at the time, decided to enjoy one of the last days of summer riding our bikes around the neighborhood. We lived in a small Midwestern town, around 1 square mile in size. It was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and crime is virtually unheard of. It was the first year we were allowed to ride our bikes around the block without supervision, and we were ecstatic about our newfound independence. It's important to describe the layout of our block. 3 sides of the block were lined with houses, and the 4th side opposite our homes contained the town's historic railroad. While still operational, the tracks and depot sat empty for much of the year, only running for holidays and special events. Being a weekday afternoon in late August, this side of the block was exceptionally quiet. We had circled the block half a dozen times or so already, and were having the time of our lives. As we pedaled down the street alongside the train station again, an old beat-up pickup truck passed us, going the opposite direction, with a gruff-looking man behind the wheel. While it was unusual to see any traffic on this road, it did connect to other neighborhoods, so it was by no means alarming. When the man reached the end of the road, he turned his pickup around, this time turning to look at us as he passed by. That was a bit strange, but we figured maybe he had just missed his turn. However, when he turned around yet again at the other end of the road, it was clear he was up to something. When he passed us by the third time, he glared at us and began to slow down, pulling his truck closer to our side of the street. Without a word, my friend and I looked at each other and immediately took off, cutting through neighbors' yards to reach the opposite side of the block as quickly as possible. As we ran, we heard the truck's tires squeal as the man fled. When we reached my driveway, we dumped our bikes and ran inside my house, yelling to my parents about what had just occurred. My dad asked for a description of the man and his truck, and immediately took off to look for him. The man was nowhere to be found, and my friend and her bike were safely taken home. We never saw that man or his truck again, and he was never identified. Needless to say, my friend and I had no desire to bike alone for a very long time. It was traumatizing to go from such a sense of elation to feeling so vulnerable and small in less than a minute. I shuddered to think of what might have happened had we not understood the potential danger and acted so quickly. As teenagers, my best friend and I lived right down the road from each other in a small suburban neighborhood and walked to each other's homes constantly. One summer night, we decided to have a sleepover complete with junk food, video games, music, and a spa night. After a few hours of being at her house, I realized I had left one of the face masks we planned to use at home. I decided to walk the short distance home and retrieve it. The sun had almost completely set, casting an eerie red glow over the dark and quiet streets. I had walked down the road past a couple of houses when I stepped under the first streetlight. As soon as I was beneath it, the light went out. I jumped in shock and laughed at myself for being so easily startled. I chalked it up to a weird coincidence and continued my walk. I passed a couple more houses and found myself beneath another streetlight. Again, the light went out as soon as I set foot in its glow. It felt stranger this time and less coincidental. The streetlights were on a timer and were not equipped with motion sensors. I picked up my pace a little. I reached the third streetlight, passed underneath it, and sure enough, it went out too. At this point, I was almost home and bolted toward my house. The last two streetlights did the same thing, and by the time I reached my house, I was completely out of breath. I burst through the door, panting, and my concerned parents asked what had happened. I explained, and they were just as confused as I was, and could not offer any comforting explanation. I was terrified and refused to walk back on my own, even though it was so close. Not sure what to make of it, but seeing how freaked out I was, my parents gave me a ride back to my friend's house, and the rest of the night continued as usual. It was one of the most bizarre things I have ever experienced, and I still have no explanation for it. I used to deliver newspapers in my early college years. As a young woman driving quiet roads in the early hours of the morning, it could be extremely unsettling. I had some terrifying moments, like the time I tossed a paper onto a customer's porch, only to be greeted by something running at me from the shadows. I screamed and ran the opposite direction. Thankfully, it turned out to be nothing more than a black cat. Sorry, neighborhood. Another time, while delivering a paper to a farmhouse, I reached out of my car window to place a paper in a customer's box, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a face staring back at me from beside the paper box. I screamed. The thing next to the paper box bolted through an open field, and I realized it was only a deer. How my approaching car didn't scare him off, I'll never know. There was one truly scary incident that happened on my route, however. It was late September, and for the past few weeks, I had noticed a car driving really slowly through a particular neighborhood around 2 a.m. It was usually a street over from me, so I never felt it was a real threat, but paid close attention to my surroundings as a precaution. This neighborhood was just outside city limits, so while not rural, it was much quieter than other neighborhoods I delivered to. One night, I was delivering papers in this neighborhood at the usual time, and the slow-moving car was nowhere to be seen. I breathed a sigh of relief and continued stuffing paper boxes as I made my way through the neighborhood. I arrived at one of the last homes in the neighborhood, the owners of which had requested to have their paper delivered directly to their door. Without a second thought, I unlocked my door and put my hand on the door handle to exit the vehicle. Just as I was about to open the door, something caught my eye. I stared, squinted, trying to bring it into focus. Couldn't be, but it was. I locked my doors in a panic and thought about what to do, still not quite believing what my eyes were seeing. There in the yard, just to the right of the house, was a tall man, standing still as could be. He was just standing there, staring directly at me. He was almost invisible in the dark, except for a small piece of reflective material on the shoulder of his jacket. I sat there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. There was no way I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. I decided to use my car's brights to get a better look at the man. I counted to 3, preparing to flee the minute I confirmed he was really there, and flicked the lights on. There, on the lawn, staring back at me, was a scarecrow. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding in, and nervous laughter escaped me. Just moments ago, I had been sure someone was silently waiting for me to get out of the car to ambush me on my way to the front door. Unbeknownst to me, the city had decided to expand their annual scarecrow contest outside city limits for the first time, in order to include the newer neighborhoods. While there was ultimately no threat, I cannot describe the terror of being sure there was a killer waiting for me out on the lawn that night. My first Ouija board experience happened when I was about 21. I always knew there was a heavy presence in my ex-boyfriend's house. I would feel it in his bedroom, and it felt like it was watching me from his closet. I could not fall asleep most nights, and would stare at the closet opening, waiting for something to appear. But nothing ever did. I finally convinced my ex that something wasn't right in the house, and he admitted to being creeped out by the closet too. I asked if he'd be willing to use a Ouija board, to which he reluctantly agreed. He had a friend who owned a board and invited him over. The 3 of us sat in the dining room, and I started to ask the questions. I asked, "How many spirits are here?" And it replied, 7. The 2 guys were laughing and insisting I was moving the planchette. I asked next, "Do you like me?" It replied with a quick, "No." This response should have made me stop, but instead, I decided I needed more. I said, "If you're here, show me. Make a sound, move something." And that's when a high-pitched whistling sound came from behind me from the kitchen. It almost sounded like a tea kettle boiling over. Apparently, this wasn't enough of a sign for me. So I said, "That was it?" Why don't you do something better? I want you to scare me." That's when I felt like something was right behind me. All of a sudden, all the hair on my arms stood up, and I got goosebumps. And then, the most terrifying, deep growl I ever heard came over my right shoulder. I can't even explain what it sounded like, but it didn't sound like a noise a human could make. It had me frozen in place, and the two guys got up and ran out of the house, leaving me there by myself. I didn't ask any more questions after that. For a few weeks after, we'd hear noises throughout the house, and things would get thrown. I remember watching a 2-liter of soda get thrown off the kitchen counter, and I would just go about my business. I still wonder if anything is happening in that house, or if it stopped. I did the Ouija board one more time at a friend's haunted house a few years ago, and had a really terrifying experience that made me swear off doing it ever again. But that's a story for another time. The Family Ghost by FearlessKingTay. I grew up in a very old house in the Midwest that my parents got for a steal. It was originally built as a hotel, and the seller was very motivated to get rid of it. Growing up, weird little things happened all the time. The typical malarkey that is easy to ignore for years and years. Footsteps, strange shadows, the feeling of being watched or followed. Swearing you see someone in the room right as you wake up. The room in the basement that chills your blood every time for no reason. The occasional hard-to-explain moments. I moved to the West Coast in my 20s for school and self-discovery. During a visit from my family, my sister told me that they had met a ghost in the house. I was pretty skeptical, but my entire family backed her up. She was in her room, and her radio had been acting up. So just on the off chance, she said, "Okay, if you're a ghost, could you just please stop it?" The radio turned off. She waited a moment and then said, "Wait, if you're a ghost, turn it on." And the radio turned on. After some experimentation, they devised a system of communication. Volume up was yes, volume down was no. The digital readout on the volume was 0 to 30, so 1 was A, 2 was B, 3 was C, and so on. If the radio turned off, then it was a sort of hard no or off-limits question. Through this system, the ghost had explained that he wanted to be called Jason. He had died in the house in 1905 at age 5 when he was sick, and he lived in the house alongside us with his kind mother and evil father. When they asked if he loved his father, the volume went to 0 and the radio turned off. In fact, he refused most questions about his father. Apparently, he was the cause of the more malevolent experiences that people had in the house. I was definitely intrigued and went back home that year to visit for a chance to experience this for myself. However, when I arrived, Jason refused to interact with me. I would leave the table and the radio would pop back on. My sisters would call me back, and the radio would turn off instantly. He didn't want to have anything to do with me. As I thought about this, I remembered an experience I had before moving to the West Coast. I had been lying in bed one night when I felt a hand ruffle my hair playfully. I freaked out. I shot out of bed, turned on the light, puffed out my chest, and overconfidently yelled, "You don't know who I am or what I'm capable of. If you try that again, you'll regret it. Don't you dare mess with me." And then several picture frames on my desk flew off onto the floor belligerently. I stayed at a friend's house that night. One night on my trip, after Jason refused to talk to me, I spoke out loud. "Hey, I'm sorry if it was you who I yelled at that one night. I bet you were trying to play or introduce yourself to me, and I got scared. I didn't need to be so mean to you, and I understand if you don't want to talk to me." The radio turned on. "Hey, are you the Jason I've heard so much about?" The volume went up. "Did I yell at you that night before I left?" The volume went up again, and then went back down to a reasonable level. "I'm sorry about that. Can we be friends?" The volume went up again. It was incredible. He had introduced himself to several family friends as well. To prove he wasn't some sort of hacked radio, he would do additional tasks. He would ring our doorbell. He would push crayons around on the table. He even did a really incredible trick for us. While asking about the logistics of being a ghost, he had turned the volume up to a question that he could travel anywhere almost instantly. To test it, we called up a family friend on the West Coast. This friend put out a newspaper on their kitchen table. Jason then visited them and came back to set the volume to the date of the paper. The radio turned off for a moment. Then, seconds later, it set the volume to 17. The friend said, "So close, the paper was for the 18th. But Jason was not convinced. Volume up, volume down, 17. Volume up, volume down, 17. 17, 17, 17. The friend checked again and apologized. "Oh, he's right. I misremembered. It's the paper from the 17th. He refused to answer any questions about God or religion. He gave us a few answers that contradicted as well. He told us he didn't need to sleep, but he had told my sister a few months earlier that he did. One thing he seemed to know was how long he would be here. Through the volume system, he told my sister he would be around until her 28th birthday, then his family would move on to the next phase. At the time, this was a couple years into the future. Sure enough, we never heard from him after that. During his time with us, he would occasionally visit our dreams. We would have these extremely realistic dreams where a boy in a white hooded robe would say hi to us, ask us to play hide and seek, or ask us questions about ourselves. Then he would confirm with my sister that he had visited us. He used the radio primarily, but in the final year he got better at manipulating other electronics. He could make printers print messages. He could manipulate televisions. He even sent us texts in the last few months. My mother had texted me, "I see you, haha," when I was back in the West Coast a couple years after all of this. I texted her back, "Did you come out here to visit? Where are you?" But she was so confused. She said she was in the Midwest at home, and her phone had no evidence of sending a text with that message to me. I texted back, "I think Jason sent me a message. Hi, Jason." And I got a reply, "Hi," again, not from my mom. My sister even once got a call with a picture of Obama and the caller ID saying Mr. President. But there was nobody there when she answered, and apparently no callback number. The radio confirmed with a volume up that Jason was goofing around. It was a wild few years with that crazy kid haunting our devices. My family still has that radio out just in case, but it hasn't turned on in years. My sister is now well into her 30s. I know this will be met with a lot of skepticism. Even I was very skeptical until I was able to meet him myself. However, I think it's finally time to share this and to answer questions people might have about it. Some frequently asked questions. Does my family still live in the house? Yes, they do. My mom and sister are around. There has been no communication or experiences from Jason or the father since my sister turned 28. You realize Jason may be a demon or lying spirit sent to trick you, right? Maybe. We haven't ruled that out yet, but it felt pretty chill. I get that that could be part of it. How did his parents die? It's unclear to us, too. I wish we had found more information on them. Why didn't you record it? Oh, we tried. Electronic recording was interfered with or glitched every single time. Jason didn't want to be recorded. Camcorders glitched. Phone video didn't save or seemed to be immediately deleted. Even audio recordings didn't work around the radio when he was active. The closed door. I have a lot of ghost stories from the home of my youth. My parents and I had many strange experiences throughout our time there, but one encounter stands out from the rest. Most of our experiences were unsettling, but didn't seem threatening. At the end of our time in that house, things escalated very quickly. It was a weekend in late February in the early 2000s, around 9 at night. I was 15 at that time, and lost in my own world of typical teenage girl things. I had my favorite CD in the stereo, singing along while I painted my nails. I was carefully trying to brush my favorite shade of pink along my pinky finger, the trickiest one, when my door suddenly burst open with a large roar. I screamed, swiping nail polish all over my finger, and kicked over the jar of polish onto the magazine I was planning to read as my nails dried. I turned around to see my little brother, who was supposed to have been sleeping, bent over in hysterical laughter. I jumped up and chased him down the hallway toward his room, yelling threats as I ran. About halfway down the hall, my mom stopped me, redirected me back toward my room, and went to handle my brother. Peeking out from behind his doorway, I watched him stick his tongue out at me. I rolled my eyes and walked back to my room. I cleaned up the mess he had caused, settled my nerves, and finally began to paint my second hand. I kept my door cracked open this time, hoping to hear his footsteps in case he tried something like that again. When I finished my nails, I began looking through my new magazine, slowly getting back to the relaxation my brother had so rudely disturbed. All seemed quiet, and I started to relax. It seemed like he had finally gone to sleep. I flipped another page and checked my nails. Not quite dry enough yet. Back to reading. Suddenly, my door slammed shut. I jumped straight to my feet, immediately filled with rage. He was going to get it this time. I ran to the door and tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. My door had no handle at this time, so there was no reason it shouldn't open easily. I slammed my fists on the door and yelled curses at my brother on the other side. That's when it occurred to me that if my brother were standing there holding the door shut, he would have to have his fingers through the hole for the doorknob. There was nothing there. I peered out into the hallway. Absolutely nothing. No one was there. Annoyed, I continued trying to pry the door open. It wasn't tight in its frame, so it shouldn't be stuck. But no matter how I tried, it would not open. I banged on the door again, yelling out for someone to help me get my door open. No answer. "Hello? Can someone let me out of here already? He did it again!" I said, still convinced my brother had somehow done this. Again, no answer. I was only steps from my parents' door, but no matter how much I yelled or banged on the door, it seemed like no one could hear me. The rage started to turn to fear when my bedroom light went out. I could still see the hallway light on through the hole in the door. What was going on? My brother was a prankster, but he wasn't old enough to pull something like this. Just then, I heard something in the corner of my room. A creak, like someone stepping on the old floorboards. Then another. I quietly tried to squeeze myself into the dark corner against the door, frantically searching for what had made that sound. Another creak. That's when something crept into the sliver of light coming through the hole in my door. The shadow of a man slowly appeared before me, standing stock still with a wild grin on his face. My heart leapt into my throat, and I screamed in sheer terror. I began banging on the door with all my might, screaming that there was someone in my room and begging for someone to let me out. All the while, this man continued toward me. After a moment, my parents came running down the hall and burst through my door as if it had never been stuck at all. I collapsed into my mother's arms, barely able to explain what happened through sobs. When I was finally able to catch my breath, I saw that the lights were back on. According to my parents, they had been on when they came into the room. My dad checked my door, but found no way it could have stuck. He checked the circuit breaker and the light switch, but everything was functioning as usual. No windows were open, and there were no drafts to have slammed the door shut in the first place. My brother was still in his room, having slept soundly through the whole thing. We were only in that house for another month, but I never slept in that room again. Am I my own shadow person? Does anyone have any thoughts on shadow people being living people from a different timeline? Possibly even yourself? Or am I crazy for thinking this? Here's my story of my shadow person throughout my life so far. I'm interested to hear if anyone has any similar experiences or thoughts on shadow people. I never thought much about the shadow person from my childhood, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, or maybe just a trick of the light. At least that's what I believed, until the day it reappeared. As a child, this shadow figure would silently stand in the doorway of the spare bedroom, watching me as I lay in bed, staring back through my open bedroom door. It would only come at night, never moving or making a sound, just watching. But somehow it never felt threatening. For years, I slept with my door open, and every night it would be there, a quiet presence. Eventually, I grew older and began closing my door, making sure it could no longer watch me. By the time I was a teenager, I had convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. Yet, even as I outgrew my childhood fears, I still found myself closing the door to the spare room every night, as though some lingering part of me remained cautious. I never saw the shadow person again during those years. Then, in my early 20s, I came back home from uni for Christmas. Staying in my old bedroom like I often did, I awoke one night to find both my bedroom and the spare room doors wide open. And there it was again, standing in the same spot, watching me, just as it had all those years ago. I stared at it, waiting for my eyes to adjust, for it to dissolve in the shadows, but it didn't. It stood there, clearly defined arms, legs, a head, but no face. I was an adult now, too old to believe in ghosts. But how could I explain this figure that had haunted my childhood, now appearing once more, just as vivid? Too frightened to get closer, I eventually crept out of bed, shut my door, and stayed awake the rest of the night. The next day, I investigated with my family, determined to find a rational explanation. We looked for anything that could cast a human-shaped shadow in the doorway. But the light source from the street had changed since I was a child, as all the street lights in the UK were updated in this time, and there was nothing that could explain the shadow appearing now, let alone during my childhood. We waited until nightfall to see if the shadow would reappear and I could find a rational explanation, but it never did. Years later, I stayed at my family home again, this time with my partner. We slept in the spare room, the very room that had always frightened me. At first, I felt uneasy, but with my partner by my side, I pushed the fear aside. But after he left early for work, I found myself alone in the house for a week. One night, while walking to the bathroom, I noticed that the door to my childhood bedroom was open. I had left it that way after clearing out some old things. I paused, staring into the room where I had spent so many nights in fear. Something strange washed over me, a shift in energy I couldn't quite explain. I stood there, frozen, as memories of my younger self staring back into the spare room flooded my mind. That's when it hit me. I was standing in the exact spot where the shadow person used to stand, looking into the same place it once had. Could it be that I had been staring at myself all along? Was I the shadow person, looking back through time at my own childhood? The thought was chilling, yet oddly comforting. All those years of fear, and perhaps I had been haunting myself. Attics Are the Worst by Unlikely Film 955. I've had quite a few different paranormal experiences in my life. This one left me more shaken than most. I was in my mid-20s and staying a few nights with my best friend at the time, C, in the house she rented with her boyfriend, B. B's parents owned the house, so their rent was cheap, but they'd often take on tasks to help maintain and renovate the home. They were in the middle of one such project, and had been regularly accessing the attic to work on in-ceiling electrical connections or some such. Because they were frequently in and out, they had moved the ceiling panel that served as the door of the attic and simply left it open until the job was complete. This took a couple of weeks. The opening was in the ceiling of the guest bedroom, and lucky me, guess where I was sleeping? Sleeping in that room with the attic open was unsettling, and I had to lay with my head covered and my back to the hole in the ceiling. But this creepy incident actually took place in the middle of the day. C and I were standing in the room as B was describing the project they were doing, when I felt compelled to look up into the hole above my head. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary attic. In the natural light, I could see a couple of work supplies and beams of the roof, but nothing abnormal. However, as if I was seeing a second layer of reality in the same place at the same time, there was movement. The best way I can describe it is as if I was seeing something in my mind's eye, even as my physical eyes saw only wood and insulation. In this second layer of vision, a black, amorphous blob was lingering at the edge of the opening, and I had the sensation of being watched, even though there was nothing discernibly alive about it at first. Nevertheless, it felt awake, conscious. I couldn't wrap my mind around this visible but invisible form, so I kept staring at it, trying in vain to form some level of comprehension. Suddenly, it moved, flowing around from the right side of the opening to the left before developing into the shape of a head and shoulders peering down over the edge. The face had no features. It was still just opaque, inky blackness, but I could tell it was looking at us, even sensing when the head seemed to turn toward me, and it realized I could perceive it as well. Getting chills and feeling quite uncomfortable now, I forced myself to look away and tune back into the words coming out of B's mouth. I convinced myself that tropes about creepy attics were running away with my imagination and pushed it from my mind. Until the next day, C and I were in her car when she suddenly got kind of quiet and serious. She said, "There's something I've been wanting to ask you, but I wanted to wait until we weren't in the house to bring this up. How do you feel about that attic being open in your room?" "It's a little creepy, and I don't like facing it when I'm trying to sleep, but it's fine, I guess," I replied. She hesitated, but then asked, "I saw you looking up there for a while yesterday. Did you see or feel anything?" Being asked this directly, I told her what I had seen, but not seen, what I had imagined in my mind's eye. All the color drained out of her face, and her voice was quiet when she finally responded. "You're really freaking me out. I've seen the exact same thing there, in the exact same way. It was black and kind of fluid, moved sort of like an amoeba or something, until it peeked out and looked down at me. I even saw it the way you described, like it was in my mind's eye and not my normal physical vision." Feeling sick to my stomach at this point, I told her I thought it had to be my imagination. Too many scary stories and movies in my life that focused on attics and got into my psyche. She said she had told herself the exact same thing, but she couldn't believe it anymore. Not after I had described to her the exact same energy, entity, creature. We couldn't decide what to call it, but neither could we deny that it was there, and in some way had exposed itself to both of us, possibly without even meaning to. She got a little stern after that, telling me she did not want to mention or acknowledge it while inside the house. Didn't want us to give it any more energy where it could possibly hear us discussing it. We dropped it after that, but falling asleep in the guest room later that night was significantly harder than it had been the night before, when I could no longer convince myself that there was nothing watching me from the attic. The Little Gray Girl by Unlikely Film 955. This is the story of the first time I saw a full-body apparition. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I would estimate I was 15 or 16, living in Golden, Colorado at that time. I spent a lot of time with my good friend Kat, who lived in a double-wide trailer with her mom, Chris, both fake names. When I first met them, they had a roommate renting their spare room, but after he moved out, it turned into a bit of a hobby supply dumping grounds for a while. It was a nice-sized room with an attached bathroom, so Chris eventually dedicated a few days to getting things organized, moving in a twin-sized bed, an old TV, and making it a functional guest room. What had previously been mountains of fabric and uncontained bobbins of thread, random boxes of buttons and free-roaming skeins of yarn, was suddenly a clean and inviting bedroom with a closet of neatly labeled boxes and drawers, everything folded and in its own predetermined place. Chris was so excited to show it off to me, as she knew I would be the person sleeping in there most frequently, and it was a great upgrade from either the couch or the floor of Kat's room. Now, when Kat and I had a sleepover, our favorite pastime was to stay up late getting good and creeped out. Slender Man was first gaining popularity on creepypasta. Marble Hornets was being released on the tube of You, and we were falling deep down the rabbit hole, not quite sure whether it was all made up, or if there was some truth to the stories and sightings being frequently recounted all over the internet. But this was the first night that I would have to pick myself up after our Fright Fest and go sleep alone in the newly appointed guest room. It had gotten late. We had run out of new creepy online videos, and we had even played a few rounds of the recently released Slender game on her laptop. As much as I didn't want to, it was time for bed. I went across the hall, climbed into the slightly squeaky, metal-framed bed, and took a few deep breaths to help calm myself for sleep. My eyes were closed, and my body was starting to relax. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps creaking across the floor inside my room. My hair immediately stood up on end all over my arms, and I could feel the familiar tingle of adrenaline in the nape of my neck. My eyes flew back open, and I put my glasses on because I felt too vulnerable to be blind at that moment. I scanned the room in the dim light from the street lamp coming through the window and saw nothing. Yet the sounds of the footsteps continued, uninterrupted and more distinguishable than ever. They started near the door, made their way diagonally through the room to the small table where the boxy 1980s TV was set up, paused, moved from the TV to the doorless closet, paused. To my building sense of dread, the steps then came toward me, getting closer until I could feel the energy of someone standing directly next to the bed and gazing at me curiously. Then they moved on, walking over to a giant teddy bear propped against a wall in his very own chair, and paused before going back over to the TV and beginning to repeat the same round they had just completed. In complete shock and amazement, I realized I couldn't possibly be imagining this, as the steps made the same rotation throughout the room 2 or 3 more full times, always pausing at each location, including right next to me, which was my least favorite, and exuding an energy of curiosity. The footsteps sounded small and light, the strides short enough that it required 3 or 4 steps every time the being moved only a few feet in any direction. I was on edge at the oddness of this experience, but there was no negative energy coming from the being as it traipsed about the room. I suddenly realized that I simply knew it was a child, curious about the changes in the room and taking its time to check out all the new fixtures in the space, including me. I knew I couldn't stare at nothing all night, following the path of the child I could hear but not see, so I finally took my glasses back off and tried to lay down, thinking that if I ignored it and let it satisfy its curiosity, then the discomforting noises would eventually stop. Well, they didn't. With all the boundless energy and determination of a child, the creaks continued their repetitive journey around the room, so consistently that I could very soon predict where they would go next, how many steps it would take to get there, and how long they would pause to stare at whatever was in front of them before moving again to the next station. I was no longer scared, but neither could I relax. I felt foolish even as I fixed my mouth to speak, but I decided to address the entity out loud. I know things are suddenly very different in here, and you're just trying to check everything out. But it's also the middle of the night, and I can't sleep with you making all this noise in here. Could you please stop for the night so I can get some rest? Finally, all the heightened energy left the room. My hair is laid back down, and my neck stopped tingling, and I heard only silence. I got comfortable in the bed again, took a few more deep breaths to resettle my nervous system, and soon fell asleep. The next morning, I was in the living room eating breakfast and telling Kat and Chris all about my experience the night before. My mom was going to arrive to pick me up soon, so as I was finishing my story, I had stood up and made my way to the entrance of the hallway so I could go back to the guest room and grab my overnight bag. I was facing them, telling them how I had finally gotten some peace and quiet, then pivoted to walk up the hall. Well, that had been the intention, but all I could do was turn before I was stopped in my tracks, unable to take a single step. Standing directly in front of me was a little girl. She looked solid and real, and I would have thought that a random neighborhood kid had found her way into the trailer, except she was all in grayscale. I would guess her to be 6 or 7 years old, and wearing a dress with a little white square apron that belonged in the late 1910s or early 20s. Her hair was straight and jaw-length, and I could tell she was a dark blonde with a small ribbon bow on one side of her head that I knew was pale blue, in spite of not actually seeing any color on her. She looked up at me with a sweet, small smile on her face and a twinkle in her eye that said, "I know you can see me, and I know you were just talking about my visit last night." She stood there in front of me for only a couple of seconds before turning to the side and leaning forward to follow a cat I couldn't see, trying to scoop it up as she walked after it, directly through the wall. In shock, I slowly turned back around to face Kat and Chris again. They could both tell something had transpired, and I know I had a look on my face that was half grin and half stunned disbelief. "What just happened?" Chris asked excitedly. "You won't even believe me if I tell you," I gasped out. "We will. We know this house is weird. What was it?" she insisted. I described the little girl. "I knew it! Kat, didn't I always say I felt like there was a little girl in here? I've been saying that for years," Chris screamed. Kat chuckled and nodded, begrudgingly admitting that yes, Chris had said that many times before. By now, my mom would be showing up any minute, so I went back to the room, gathered up my pajamas and toothbrush, and quietly said a goodbye to the little girl. "You can come visit me again if you want, just not in the middle of the night next time," I said to the empty room. Though I stayed many more nights in that home, I never saw or heard the little girl again. Someone was following us. Back in 2010, my mom and 2 aunts from my father's side went back to college to pursue teaching. The area where the college is located is more of a countryside. It's a beautiful area, but when the night comes, it gets really dark. Since it was still a developing city, the streetlights weren't that bright. It was around 8 p.m. when they were heading back home from the college. They walked back home every day since it was only a 5 to 10 minute walk. My mom was at the front while my 2 aunts were behind her walking and conversing. When she looked behind, she noticed someone was tailing them. She didn't think much of it, since the girl behind my aunts was also wearing the same college uniform they were. As they were walking down our street, my mom was dumbfounded when the street dogs started barking. They were very familiar with the street dogs that live near us, and the dogs would even wag their tail every time they walked past, since they gave them treats every day. That's when my mom started to grow suspicious. They lived at the end of the street, yet the girl was still behind them. My aunts noticed that my mom kept looking behind them. When they were finally at the gate of our house, she peeked behind once more, but the girl she saw wasn't there anymore. My mom told them, "Someone was following us. My aunts raised their eyebrows and said, "Huh? Nobody's there." My mom told them that a girl with the same college uniform as them was tailing them. My aunts told my mom that when she started looking behind, they looked behind as well, but nobody was there. My mom was pregnant with my little brother at the time, and living in a province at night with someone pregnant is scary as hell here in the Philippines. There's a folklore here about a mythical creature called manananggal. It is said that manananggals prey on pregnant women. They can sever their own upper torso and grow bat-like wings to fly and hunt at night, using their long tongues to suck the fetus out of a pregnant woman's womb. I don't normally believe in these things, but when I started hearing some noise crawling on our roof while my mom was pregnant, I was scared shitless. My grandma would put cloves of garlic and salt around the house, especially on windows, treating it like a vampire. I don't know if my mom saw a ghost or some mythical creature, but it's still a creepy story that she tells us to this day. Something Was Under My Bed by Queen Jen. As far as paranormal experiences go, this is probably one of the scariest ones I've had, even though it wasn't really that extreme compared to a lot of stories I've heard and read. Either way, it happened sometime in 2013 when I was 19. I had my room in the basement in my dad's house. It was late at night, and I lay there on my bed in complete darkness. I needed to sleep because I had school the next day, but I suffered from insomnia back then and felt too energetic to go to sleep. I lay there for a good while with thoughts swirling around in my mind when I suddenly heard a noise. I opened my eyes, but it was completely dark. I started to think I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, scratching. From there, it went on, getting more and more intense, and I quickly realized the noise was coming from underneath my bed. My eyes widened, and panic spread throughout my body. It sounded as if someone was frantically clawing on the floor. Did I leave one of the cats in here before I went to bed? I thought, trying everything to rationalize the situation. But I already knew, not even a cat could make that kind of noise. Then I felt something, like a scratching and punching against my back from underneath my mattress. The best way I can describe the whole thing is to imagine some poor soul being trapped inside a coffin, desperately trying to break out, and I was on top of that coffin. I was paralyzed by the shock of it all, not knowing what to do. After I had been laying there for a good while, with the scratching and punching still going on, my fear eventually turned into some kind of rage. I jumped out of bed, ran across the room, and turned on the lights. Then I threw myself on the floor, looked under the bed, and yelled, "What do you want from me?" Nothing was there. The scratching had stopped, and there was no one in the room except me. I somehow managed to fall asleep after that experience. A couple of months later, a friend of mine from school moved into our house. She rented a room from my dad on the top floor. After she had been there for 3 nights, she came to me in the morning and said she'd had the craziest thing happen to her during the night. I could almost feel my skin turn pale as she told me the story of the exact same thing that had happened to me. The scratching, the punching against the mattress. I knew for certain that I had never told her about my experience. We were both really freaked out when I told her the exact same thing had happened to me 2 floors down, just months earlier. The Naughty Little Ghost Girl. A few years ago, my husband and I started looking for our first home. We looked at a number of houses in different cities, hoping to find one that would be a good fit for our family. We had seen quite a few cute homes in our price range, but none had been quite the right fit for our family so far. One day, we decided to bring our daughter along to a series of home tours in a small town that sounded promising. She had just turned 3 and was very excited to help us pick out a new house. She wandered through each house on the tour with glee, telling us which rooms and features she liked, and imagining what life would be like in the houses. It was a very exciting day for her. We reached one of the last homes on the tour, a beautiful Victorian-style home with a lot of history, but without the restrictions of living in the historic district. It was a great price, lots of space, and modernized without destroying the home's character. We were very excited about this home, until we went upstairs. It was a typical layout for an older home. At the top of the stairs was a landing, and there was a bedroom on either side. The bedroom to the left was the smaller of the two, the perfect size for our 3-year-old's bedroom. She was busy spinning circles and telling me where she was going to put her toys. My husband had walked across to the larger bedroom while I tried to convince our daughter to come check it out with us. She finally reluctantly agreed, turning around to take one last glimpse of the room as I started making my way to the next. I heard a screech, followed by the sound of little feet moving quickly as she ran into the other bedroom. I asked what her scream was all about, but she was too interested in what my husband was doing to respond. She was notorious for her loud and random noises at that age, so I didn't think much of it and just followed her into the next room. There was a door to the attic in the far corner of the room, and my husband had just opened it up to check it out. My daughter followed, intrigued by the mysterious door in the bedroom. I was admiring the built-in bookshelf when I heard a thud from inside the attic. At this, my husband abruptly spun around, scooped up our daughter, and booked it down the stairs. I followed quickly behind, confused about what had just happened. Later that night, after putting our daughter to bed, my husband told me that when he looked into the attic, he had seen something move, but assumed it was his own shadow as he started to enter the attic. It then moved again, this time coming directly toward him, knocking over a box and causing the huge thud as it did. That's when he spun around, grabbed our daughter, and booked it downstairs. I thought that was spooky enough, but what my daughter said the next day sent chills down my spine. The next morning at breakfast, my daughter was still ranting and raving about the house we had visited. She kept asking me questions about what it would be like when we lived there. I gently let her know that while we were going to get a house, it probably wouldn't be that one. To my surprise, she seemed perfectly fine with that. Then she asked, "When we get a new house, will the girl be there?" Confused, I replied, "What girl?" "The girl," she said. "I don't know what girl you're talking about, sweetie," I said. Frustrated and fully expecting me to know who she was talking about, she sighed. "You know, that naughty little girl at the house we looked at. She turned around and looked at me and I screamed." I remembered the little scream she let out as she left the small bedroom the day before, right before my husband saw something in the attic. We had been careful not to talk about that incident around her because we didn't want to frighten her. I didn't know how to respond, so I just reassured her that only she, myself, my husband, and our pets would be going to the new home with us. That answer seemed to satisfy her, and we moved on. I told my husband about what she had said later that night, and he was as freaked out as I was. It was one thing for him to have an experience, but for our 3-year-old to have her own separate experience without any talk of ghosts, other children, or anything remotely spooky was downright terrifying. All I can say is I'm really glad we didn't get that house. The Most Horrifying Camp with My Friends by Den. It was October 29th, 2024, and we were all 15. About 2 weeks before, I had organized a Halloween meetup with my 3 childhood friends at my house, which is pretty isolated, set far away from the city and near some empty farms. It's been a tradition every year to invite my friends over to camp out in a tent outside my house, but this time I wanted to add some extra excitement. For privacy, I'll call my friends Ray, G, and Adam. Ray was the funny, tall, and average-built one. G was shorter, but super chill, the kind of friend you could always relax with. Adam was my best childhood friend. We'd hung out almost every day each summer since we were 10 and had been in the same class for 6 years straight. They planned to arrive around 2 p.m., and we aimed to head to our camp area by 4 p.m. Ray and Adam arrived first, so we set up snacks, packed our backpacks, and just joked around like any other 15-year-olds. We planned to get to the camp area using a couple of motorized bicycles and my dirt bike. I had my dirt bike, Adam had his own motorized bicycle, and I also had a second bike that Ray could use. But soon we realized that Adam's bike had a busted clutch cable. We spent a while trying to fix it, but we only made things worse. By the time G showed up at 3:30, we had to adjust our plan. We decided that I'd take G on the dirt bike, Adam would ride my other bike, and Ray would wait back at my house while I made a return trip to pick him up once we got the others set up at the camp. The camp area was about 8 kilometers away, requiring us to cross a quiet highway and then follow a bumpy, gravelly farm road. This camp area wasn't anything official, just a flag spot in the middle of a field where I liked to go chill and clear my thoughts. By the time G and I arrived, it was already getting dark, so I rushed back to get Ray. When we finally all gathered at the spot, G and Adam had already set up the firewood but hadn't lit the fire yet. It was pitch black, and the place felt eerier than usual. We got the fire going and started grilling sausages, enjoying the solitude. The area is always empty. No one ever uses that road. Then, out of nowhere, we saw a helicopter fly over us. We laughed nervously, wondering if they'd spotted the fire and thought it was some sort of cult gathering. About 3 minutes later, we saw car headlights off in the distance, maybe 2 kilometers away. The car seemed to just be sitting there, with its lights on, but after a few moments it turned them off. We thought it was weird, but didn't give it too much thought. Then we noticed a massive tractor, one of those with crop-cutting blades in front, slowly moving through the field about 200 meters away. We didn't think anything of it at first, but then it started heading straight toward us. We quickly moved our bikes and bags out of the way, but the tractor kept getting closer, like it had no intention of stopping. At the last second, I grabbed our helmets and moved them just before the tractor rolled over the fire, extinguishing it. Then it stopped right there, turned off its lights, and just stood still. It was pitch dark, and we couldn't see inside the cab. We all stood there, creeped out, wondering why it would almost run us over, and then just stop. The tractor stayed in place for what felt like an eternity. None of us could see a thing inside, and the thought that someone was just sitting there, silently watching us, gave us chills. Finally, I told everyone to pack up as fast as possible. 2 of my friends somehow squeezed onto the back of my dirt bike, and Adam got onto the motorized bike. We sped off, with one of my friends clinging on and nervously looking back. He said the tractor was still just sitting there in the dark, without its lights on, as we got about 100 meters away. After a tense, silent ride, we finally made it back home about 20 minutes later. We tried to brush it off, only mentioning it once, but the whole experience left us shaken. Now, thinking back, I can't help but wonder what the driver's intentions were. Why would someone drive so close to us, extinguish our fire, then just sit there in silence? I keep imagining that while we were staring into that dark cab, maybe the driver had already slipped out of the tractor, silently watching us from behind one of the wheels, hidden in the shadows just a few steps away for those straight 5 minutes. The thought sends chills down my spine. Haunted ICU ward. First off, I swear on everything, the story is as accurate as I remember it, and in no way, shape, or form made up. About a year and a half ago, I worked maintenance at an older hospital. Around 11 p.m., the fire alarm goes off. It's part of our responsibility to investigate and be sure there isn't a real fire. So the other maintenance guy and I look at the fire panel to see which alarm is activated. It's showing a smoke detector in the old cardiac ICU as the culprit. Mind you, this unit has been empty since early 2020 when the new unit was finished being built. So we step off the elevator, go through the locked double doors, and walk down the dark, dimly lit hallway around the corner. We come up to the nurses' station, and it's fully staffed with critical patients in almost every room. We didn't really think much of it at the time, but something that stuck out to us was everyone seemed to stop what they were doing and in complete silence just stared at both of us. We figured they must have moved back, and since we're the evening shift, no one told us. We locate the activated smoke detector, verify there is no smoke or fire, and go back to the panel to clear out the alarms and notify the fire department that there is no fire. The very next day or so, we're back in the same unit replacing light bulbs or something. This time, every single room is full of furniture, extra beds, chairs, etc., and the whole ward is a mess that looks like it hasn't been touched in years. Dust on the desks, stains on ceiling tiles, trash piled up, computer monitors unplugged, and stuff along those lines to insinuate that the unit is still closed. The Man at the Bus Stop by VerDaily.com. So this weird thing happened to me a while back, and I still get creeped out thinking about it. I was waiting for the bus one night after a long shift at work. It was dark, and the street lights kept flickering, making everything feel kinda off. As I stood there scrolling through my phone, I noticed this guy across the street at the bus stop. He looked kinda shady, worn-out clothes and this intense stare that made me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore him, telling myself I was just being paranoid. A few minutes passed, and I looked up again. The guy was still there, but now he was staring right at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I thought maybe he was just waiting for someone, so I tried to shake it off. Then my bus finally showed up. I hopped on and found a seat by the window. As we started driving away, I looked back, and there he was, still watching me. My stomach dropped. The bus ride felt way too long. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see him following us. When I finally got off at my stop, I rushed to my apartment, trying to shake off that creepy feeling. But then, the next night, I had to wait for the bus again, and guess what? That same guy was there. He was even closer this time, and I was freaking out. I couldn't wait for my bus to come. When the bus arrived, I practically jumped on and sat down, but I was still nervous. I kept looking back, thinking he was somehow connected to me. I couldn't help it. Finally, I got off at my stop again and rushed home. I decided I would avoid that bus stop for a while. But a few nights later, I thought, it's probably all in my head, and went back out. Guess who was there? Yep, the same guy. This time, he had this creepy smile on his face. I got on the bus again, my heart racing. I was sure he was coming after me. When I finally got off, I sprinted home, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every little noise. Days went by, and I finally decided to switch up my routine. I took a different bus line and went out of my way to avoid that guy. But one night, I got on a bus, and there he was, sitting right across from me. I was frozen. He stared at me and then leaned in closer, whispering, "I've been waiting for you." My heart dropped. I bolted off the bus at the next stop and didn't stop running until I got home. I locked the door and sat in my living room, trying to figure everything out. The next morning, I decided to report him to the police. I told them what happened, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They said there wasn't much they could do unless he did something to me. I started carrying pepper spray and asked friends to walk with me to the bus stop. One night, I was out with friends and completely forgot about the guy. We were laughing and having a great time, but when I was walking home, I passed that old bus stop and felt my heart drop. Guess who was waiting there? Yep, that creepy dude. He wasn't just staring this time. He was right in front of the bus stop, looking like he was waiting for me. I couldn't believe it. I turned to walk away, but he shouted, "You can't run from me forever!" I ran home like I was being chased. That was it for me. I never went back to that bus stop. I found a new job closer to home, started taking Ubers, and did everything I could to avoid that part of town. It's been years, and I still think about that guy. Did he mean to scare me? Was he just a creep, or was there something more to him? Honestly, I'm just glad I never found out. I went hiking with a guy, and he showed me a dead body. This started when I was at my childhood friend's apartment for what was supposed to be a fun little movie night. We hadn't hung out in a while, and we were catching up. Her place was cozy, a little disorganized, and full of girly decor. We were in our comfiest sweatpants about to watch princess movies. Her apartment isn't the most tidy. Things are a bit scattered around, but it's clean and so authentic, which always made me feel at home. We decided on ordering pizza for dinner. She mentioned that Sherwood, someone I hadn't met yet, would bring the pizza over. At first, I was not happy to hear that. I thought that she meant she had invited other friends, a boy, over to join us, which wasn't what I had in mind. But I was in for a surprise. Sherwood turned out to just be our delivery guy for the night. He wasn't joining us. When he got to the apartment, there was this awkward air about him. He was obviously nervous, fumbling a bit with the pizza boxes and not quite making eye contact. My friend introduced us quickly, and it was clear from her overly thankful demeanor that Sherwood did a lot more for her than just fetch dinner. After handing us the pizza, there was this brief moment of forced small talk. My friend was super nice to him despite his awkwardness. He wasn't the best conversationalist and seemed really out of place. Then Sherwood asked for my number. I was in a tough spot because our mutual friend was sitting right there, so I just gave it to him. We chatted for maybe 5 minutes before my friend gave him a cue to leave with something like, "Thanks so much for dropping this off." He seemed to get the hint. We both gave him a hug before my friend said something like, "Drive safe," giving him another kind of cue to leave. When I asked my friend what that was all about, she basically explained that Sherwood was her unpaid personal assistant. He did her grocery shopping, he dropped off pizza, and he did all this other stuff. I think Sherwood was just really a lonely guy, desperate for interaction, especially female interaction. My friend and I were both young and immature back then. We were about 23, but I think we both knew something was seriously wrong with Sherwood. It was a little hard to articulate because we couldn't point out exactly what his problem was. Sherwood started a group chat with my friend and I. He just sent a meme or two every week. It felt like he was trying to stay relevant without being intrusive. Maybe he was used to being sidelined or even blocked by other girls in the past. It felt like he was trying to make me remember him, but also carefully trying not to give me a reason to block him too. I can't speak on his behalf. That's just what it felt like. Sherwood also offered help with errands. The first time I said, "Thanks for asking, but no." He asked every weekend after that. One day, I made the mistake of accepting his help. I knew better. I had recently found a great deal for a new washing machine on Craigslist, but I had no idea how to pick it up and install it. When I mentioned it in the chat, Sherwood excitedly volunteered to take care of the whole thing. He handled the whole pickup and installation like a total champ, which saved me so much hassle. I tried to pay him for his efforts because I wanted to show appreciation, but he wouldn't accept any money. I insisted. Eventually, he suggested that I could repay him by joining him for a hike. Like, what? I was uneasy about this. It felt a bit too personal and almost like it could be mistaken for a date. But Sherwood framed it as nothing more than a friendly outing, like a transaction to balance out the favor. I agreed to the hike. I rationalized it by telling myself it was fair trade for installing the washing machine, and that it was genuinely a form of payment, especially since I didn't think he had too many friends. This hike felt like maybe a way for him to have some companionship. I thought it might be nice helping him. Part of me was still uneasy about spending time with him in such an isolated setting. The day of the hike, Sherwood picked this trail that was nearby. I had been there before. It's gorgeous. As we walked along together, he chatted about ordinary things like work, the weather, and his hobbies. Everything seemed normal until he suggested we go off the main path to see something special he wanted to share. Like, what could that even mean? We reached this secluded spot, and there, oh my gosh, was a dead body. My heart pounded so violently as Sherwood stood there, so eerily calm and nonchalant. The casualness in his demeanor made me feel even more uneasy. It felt like he wasn't just showing me a dead body, but also revealing this darker side of himself. It smelled bad, but not like in the movies. I didn't know how long it had been there. I'm not a biologist, but my guess is that it had smelled a lot worse before, but now it had gone down. At that moment, I mumbled some excuse about needing to get back quickly and started walking briskly toward the main path. I was urging Sherwood to follow me. I thought maybe this was some twisted mind game, like a way to intimidate me or show me that he wasn't just some harmless little boy. Maybe he was trying to send a message that said, "You should know I'm familiar with things like this." Or there's another possibility. Maybe he just wanted me to think about him more. Sometimes when I talk to people, I feel like they only notice me for the time that we're together, and then they won't think of me again until the next time we meet. It's possible Sherwood felt that way with me, and maybe he thought showing me a dead body would make him less forgettable. I have no idea. But on the surface, he seemed oblivious to how inappropriate this was. As we walked back together, I was in full fight-or-flight mode, instinctively looking around to see if there were other hikers or rangers, anyone who could make me feel like I wasn't alone. The moment I spotted someone else on the trail, I called out. Not to expose Sherwood, but just asking for directions back to the parking area. I wanted to make sure Sherwood and I wouldn't be left alone together. I asked this gentleman to walk us back to the parking lot. I wasn't going to take no for an answer. I kept pretending like I was confused about his directions, and eventually he agreed to just walk us there. Getting help from that guy was my way of re-anchoring myself to safety and normality while I was still under the shock of what Sherwood had shown me. We got to the parking area. There, I called my friend and told her I was with Sherwood. I suggested he could drop me off with her and that we'd be there in 20 minutes. Sherwood agreed. That was my way of making sure that if anything happened, it was on the record that Sherwood was the last person to have been with me. Also, I immediately texted my friend what had happened to get that on the record too. When I got to her apartment, we said thanks to Sherwood and kindly told him to go away. I had already told her through text, but then I started going into all the detail. The fact that the body had insects, the fact that the face was decomposing but still recognizable. Her reaction was pure horror, not just about the dead body, but also how nonchalantly Sherwood had treated the whole situation. She had confessed she always sensed something was off about him, even though she'd never imagined anything this disturbing. We both agreed that we needed to remove Sherwood from our lives. She admitted she felt stuck, and she had become too reliant on Sherwood to just fire him cold turkey. We planned out how we would do it. It was this gradual phasing out plan. We would limit our interaction times to when others were present. We would slowly reduce our responses to his texts. I would never ask for his help again, and my friend would ask for less and less help. Sherwood kept texting during weekends, offering to run errands or asking if we needed anything, to which my friend would reply, "I'm trying to work on being more independent, but you've really been such a help." Eventually, as my friend started dating someone new, she introduced Sherwood to her boyfriend. Sherwood never contacted her after that. I had called the cops the same night of the incident, but it was a while before we heard more news about it. At least a full month later, a news report confirmed discovering a dead body in that area where Sherwood had taken me hiking. They made an arrest, not of Sherwood, but of this other guy that Sherwood followed on Instagram. I have no idea if Sherwood was connected to the murder. Reflecting on everything, I think there's one clear moral of the story. Trust your instincts. My Patient Freaked Me Out by Outside Pain 4561. I've been debating whether or not to share this, but it's been on my mind for a long time, so here it goes. I apologize in advance for the lengthy post, but I think it needs context. This incident happened about 3 years ago. I work in healthcare as a patient care technician, basically a CNA, but in a hospital instead of a nursing home. During this particular night shift, my responsibility was to sit with a confused patient to keep him safe. He had dementia, so he would try to get up, wander around, or pull out his IVs. My job was to make sure he didn't get up on his own to prevent falls, and to keep him from pulling out any lines. This kind of sitter role is pretty common for confused patients in hospitals. The patient was in his 80s, and he was so confused he didn't even know his own name or where he was. Things were going smoothly. He fell asleep around 11 p.m., but then woke up around 1 a.m. and looked over at me. To get my attention, he said, "Hey, Victoria." That's not my name, but since he was confused, I didn't think much of it at first. I told him my actual name and asked if he needed anything, but he kept calling me Victoria 3 more times. Here's where it got strange. My parents almost named me Victoria. It came down to that or my real name. They ultimately chose my name because my dad wasn't a fan of Tory spelling. The names aren't even similar. I asked the nurse if this patient had any family members named Victoria or had previously had a nurse by that name, but there was no connection. No family member, spouse, or prior caregiver with that name. Trying to shake off the odd feeling, I told myself it was probably just his confusion. But a short while later, he started singing the theme song to the Beverly Hillbillies, and that's when I really got the chills. When I was little, my parents used to recite that theme song as if it were a bedtime story when my siblings and I asked for a story. The whole situation gave me an eerie feeling, like this man somehow knew things about me, even though we had never met. There's no way he could have known any of my family. This was in my college town, far from where I grew up. I might be overthinking it, but years later, I still think about this night and the unsettling feeling I had. Has anyone experienced anything similar or have any thoughts on this? I'd love to hear any insights. I saw him after he died. Not a ghost story. By A Little Bit Morbid. This happened a few years ago, and whenever it's this time of year, I remember it because his birthday is coming up. My mom had an ex, whom I'll call Jay for this story, who she was with for a few years. He was like a stepdad to me. We didn't always get along, me being an angry teenager and him not being the easiest person, but in the time before he passed from a sudden heart attack at age 49, our relationship had gotten better, which made it much worse when he was suddenly gone. He died in 2013. Sometime after that, I can't remember exactly how much time had passed, but it must have been about a year after this, I was grocery shopping. The supermarket was nowhere near where Jay used to work or live. It was a sunny, warm day. I was done with my shopping and had just returned my cart and was making my way across the parking lot back to my car when I saw a car of the same make, model, and color as his. Not too unusual. Then a guy dressed the same way Jay used to dress was walking up to it. I only saw him from behind at that moment. Black jeans, black t-shirt tucked in, leather belt, same haircut and color. Okay, I thought. Not a weird way to dress. Could be any guy, and the haircut and color weren't rare either. He opened the door of his car, turned around like he knew I was watching, smiled and waved at me, then got in. I could not move. I was shocked. I then hastily walked back to my car. Could not be him. It could not be. I had parked my car in reverse, so when I sat down in it, I could see other cars coming and going. I opened my window because I had to gather myself for a moment, and it was hot in the car. Then I saw his car leaving his spot. He had to pass my car, so I got a closer look. He had a few feathers bound together with a leather strip hanging from his rear mirror like Jay always had. His window was down. He wore sunglasses, same shape and color as Jay did. He looked exactly as I remembered him, and he was blasting one of Jay's favorite songs. He again smiled and waved at me, and then drove away, still smiling. I must have sat there for about half an hour. I was at his funeral. He was cremated. I held his urn. We cried and mourned him. My mom also went there, even though they were not a couple anymore. But I had just seen him, in broad daylight. I mean, the smiling and waving could have been because I was staring at him, and he was a random guy who felt flattered that a woman half his age was staring at him. But everything, every detail I saw. The car was the same. It was an older car, the color not too common. Clothing and style were the same. The sunglasses, the feathers, the music, his mannerisms, the way he walked, waved, smiled. It felt unreal, like I had witnessed something I should not have seen, like a secret. Also, him turning around when he was by his car, then looking at me like he knew me, like he knew I was there. I have no idea what happened there. Until I woke up by very emotional laptop. This happened when I was around 12. My family and I had traveled to Malaysia to visit relatives who lived in Sarawak. My family is known for their deep spiritual beliefs and rich traditions. Stories of spirits and supernatural encounters were common in our household, passed down through generations. Almost everyone in my family had a tale of an encounter, be it a whisper in the night or a shadow glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Me, being a skeptic at that age, thought these stories were just ways to scare kids into behaving. One of my uncles ran a small money transfer business, exchanging foreign currency for Malaysian ringgit. His work often took him to nearby neighboring cities like Cebu or Selangor, and I looked up to him so much that I'd tag along whenever he let me. One night, during a family dinner, my uncle mentioned he needed to meet a business partner in Cebu the following week. He asked if I wanted to come along, and of course, I jumped at the chance. A few days later, we left for Cebu. If you've never been, Cebu is beautiful. Even now, I go back just to soak in the atmosphere whenever my mom and I visit Malaysia. Anyway, most of the trip passed in a blur, as it just consisted of me following my uncle to different venues and eating as much local food as I could. But eventually, it was time to head home. The drive back started out quiet and peaceful. It was late, and after the excitement of the trip, I was drowsy. You know those car rides where you can feel the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the car pulling you into sleep? That is exactly what happened to me as I began resting my head on the seatbelt as I slowly closed my eyes to a deep slumber. Until I woke up. There was a sound, knocking, sharp, insistent knocks that jolted me awake. I was still in the car, but we were driving along a winding road on a mountainside, the dark trees closing in around us. I glanced at my uncle. His face was tense, and both hands were clenched on the wheel. Normally, he'd have the radio on, humming along to some tune, but now the car was dead silent. I heard the knocks again, this time from the back right window. The sound was too loud and deliberate to be pebbles or branches hitting the glass. I looked back, trying to make sense of it, but before I could fully turn, my uncle's voice cut through the air, cold and stern. Tengo te pan, which means look forward. I froze. He sounded different, like he was barely holding back a tremor. He told me to keep my eyes forward, to look down if I had to, but not to turn around. My stomach twisted. Confusion and fear swirled together as the knocks grew louder, moving from one window to the next. Each hit sharper and more insistent, like something was trying to get in. My hands clenched the seat, my body trembling as I felt the urge to turn around, to look, but my uncle's command echoed in my head. Then, as if on cue, the knocking escalated, pounding from every window. The sound became deafening, drowning out even the rev of the engine. My chest tightened, and tears started slipping down my cheeks as the car began speeding up, the engine roaring louder, trying to outrun whatever was out there. Then, silence. In an instant, the knocking stopped. The only sound left was my uncle's shaky breath and the low rumble of the car. I don't remember much of the rest of the drive. My uncle kept talking, forcing a conversation about school or friends, anything to distract us from what had just happened. But I could see it in his eyes. Beneath his calm mask, he was just as shaken as I was. Years later, I came back to visit my hometown with my mom, and one night my uncle finally told me the full story. He explained that the mountain road we'd driven on was known to be haunted. He admitted that while I slept, he had seen something, a flash of black in the rearview mirror, almost like a shadow darting across the back seat. And just before I woke up, he'd heard it too, a whisper from somewhere behind us. Tengo te pan. It still gives me chills to this day that the warning never came from him. The Mimic in the Woods. Okay, so a little bit of backstory. I live in a very small rural community in the Pacific Northwestern tip of the United States. My town is surrounded by miles and miles of woods, and there are several small native reservations nearby. My family picks and sells mushrooms for a living when they're in season, so we all spend a pretty huge chunk of our days out in the woods, sometimes even after dark, with the help of headlamps and flashlights. There's kind of an unspoken but widely known phenomenon locally that there is some sort of entity, for lack of better words, that roams through the woods starting around dusk and lingers throughout the night, which isn't spoken of often. My mom and stepdad have seen these things beforehand, both in the area I saw it tonight and in another location approximately 20 or so miles on the opposite outskirts of town. Tonight, I had my first occurrence. This is what happened. It had become dark in the woods quick, and our mushrooming group each had small LED lights. Not too bright, but just enough to see about 2 feet or so ahead of you. I had randomly started to become uneasy and feel like something was off. The forest had become very quiet. I would hear a small branch crackle nearby, randomly, every now and then for about 10 to 15 minutes, to which I chalked off as possibly being a cougar, until I saw one of our other lights, maybe 25 to 30 foot or so to my left. I was instantly relieved and kept picking like normal, knowing it was either my mom or her buddy nearby, and that I was safe at that point. About every few minutes, I'd look up and see the light flash again. One to the left, and then caught sight of another ahead of me shortly after, to which I'd assumed was my mom. I started following the lights, since we like to stay somewhat nearby each other, but not close enough to where we're stealing mushrooms from one another's patch, and feeling quite safe again. Eventually, I heard a man and woman talking, and the woman's voice sounded exactly like my mom, but it was far enough that I couldn't quite make out what they were saying. I felt safe, to say the least, knowing I wasn't out there alone, since it was getting very dark at this point in time, and I was about ready to head back to the car. Eventually, I made my way further to the left, and had stopped going deeper into the woods, where I heard and saw their lights, when I ran into the second friend we'd brought with us. There were 4 of us total, and followed him back to the car out of the woods. When we got back to the car, my mom and the first friend were already there and had been out of the woods for at least half an hour. I have no idea what I was following in those woods, but they mimicked our lights and sounded exactly like my mom and friends' voices. They were leading me deeper and deeper into the woods by myself. I tell my story to everyone in the car as we're driving off, and learn that 2/3 of the other occupants have seen these exact same lights and voices in that same thick wooded area. There was no one else around for miles. Has anyone experienced anything similar to this phenomenon? And does anyone know what in the hell it could possibly be? The more I think about it, the scarier it gets. Whatever these things were, they knew I was alone. They knew nobody was nearby or close enough to see or hear them other than me. They were luring me deeper into the dark, thick woods. They mimic the voices of people in your group to confuse and disorient you, and try to single you out away from your group. I have so many questions, and I am so freaked out. A Missing Child Reappeared by SameFly5110. This is an old story, but it still trips me out to think about. So I'd say like 5-ish years ago, I was babysitting my cousin's son. He was around 10 at the time. My cousin lives in a condo complex in our hometown that's super small and kid-friendly. Her son asked if he could go outside while I was watching him and his 2 younger siblings, who were about 7 and a newborn at the time. The oldest is really good at listening to instructions, and he is a good kid. I took note of what he was wearing because I told him to change into appropriate play clothes. I told him that he could only play in the courtyard where I could see him from the window. Eventually, his mom came home and asked where he was. I told her I let him play in the courtyard. He was not there anymore, at all. We started searching and yelling for him. Neighbors and other family members that lived nearby came to help out. Police came and searched inside her condo and in his room. As they were about to make the call to start a literal search around town, while we were all talking in the courtyard, he walked out of the condo, out the front door, and wearing an entirely different outfit than what he left to play in. The cop was confused because he also searched in the condo. He literally went back in to make sure there were no secret tunnels, in his words, because it just made no sense. I asked my cousin's son what happened and where he had been, and he said, "I laid down under that tree," and he pointed to a nearby tree in the courtyard. "And then I fell asleep, and then I saw a bright light, and I woke up in my bedroom." So weird. I think about it often. She Was Just Here by Help Blondie. I'm starting to talk about the paranormal things that I have encountered, as there have been a lot. My mom says that we are more open to the spiritual world, as she has experienced very weird and unexplained things the same way that I have. This story is one told by my grandmother. I did not experience it myself, but I would like to hear your thoughts on the story. My grandmother lives in a small village in Serbia, and there are a lot of weird things that happen there. I remember her first telling me this story when I was a bit younger, and we still talk about it. I get creeped out every time we talk about it. So here it goes. About 30 years ago, when my grandmother first moved to this village, there was a murder that happened 2 streets away from her. An elderly couple that had been married for 40 years got into a big argument. The wife turned away from the husband mid-argument to go outside. He took a heavy metal pan and hit her on the back of her head. She immediately fell down, and he said he couldn't find her pulse. He claimed that he didn't want to kill her, and that he just wanted to stop her from going away. He knew that if he called the police, there was no way he could get out of it. He rolled her body in a carpet and buried her under cement in the basement of their house. 2 months went by, and his conscience got the best of him. He went to the police and admitted what he had done. When the police asked him why he was admitting to the crime now, he said that she was haunting him. He said every morning she would stand in the kitchen, as if she was alive, and make him coffee and breakfast. He would try to close his eyes and open them again, but she wouldn't go away. The police, of course, said this was his conscience getting the best of him, but he claimed she was really there and that he wasn't crazy. He was arrested, and the police, of course, didn't pay any attention to what the man was saying about his wife's ghost. When the police went to talk to neighbors to try to gather information and see if anybody had heard or seen anything, they were left shocked. All of the neighbors swore that they had seen her over the past 2 months. One of the neighbors said she came to buy eggs a couple of days prior, and she was last seen by another neighbor just 2 days prior going for a walk. They said hi to each other, and the neighbor swore it was her. The police immediately formed a new theory, and it was that the man had just killed his wife and went into a shock or denial and got the timing wrong, or that he was lying for some reason. When the police finally got the body out of the cement, it was confirmed that the woman had died at least 2 months ago, confirming the husband's story. Even after the date of her murder was released, the neighbors still claimed that they had seen her, even though that was not possible. After the woman's burial, her 2 sisters were coming to her house to retrieve some of the items, and they claimed that they saw her from outside, washing the dishes and smiling at them from the window. The house this happened in is now abandoned, as nobody ever moved in after the murder. I get creeps every time I have to go by that house and avoid it at all times. My Grandma Healed My Brother by Word Disastrous 7633. So back when I was little, my brother had an enlarged artery and a heart murmur that we were constantly going back and forth to multiple hospitals to try to treat. When I was 7 and my brother was 9, my grandma passed away. We had only met her a couple times as we had immigrated to the United States and she was back in the old country. The world wasn't so connected yet, with video calling, cheap flights, etc. A few days after she died, my brother woke up in tears. He told us he saw our grandma in his dream, and she smiled at him and pointed at his heart, then touched it. My parents were spooked, but wrote it off as a dream. The next time we went to the hospital, The doctors were astonished. No murmur, no enlargement. Everything was completely normal and healthy. It still sends chills down my spine and gives me a knot in my throat. I'm so happy and lucky to still have my brother in my life, and he's even started a family of his own now. My great-grandmother's last story before her death. My great-grandmother from my mother's side passed away 2 years ago. She was about 95 to 100 years old. I do not know the exact age because I never asked. 2 months before her death, she told us about an incident that happened many years ago when she was a preteen. She had a maternal aunt who was well known for her beauty. They came from a family of zamindars, aka nobles. Ever since she turned 12, her grandfather started having nightmares of a man who told him to never let his granddaughter get married, as she will be his wife. The grandfather sought the help of an elder to know what that dream actually meant. The elder said that the man he saw in his dream was a jinn who had fallen for his granddaughter. Though he didn't really believe in jinns, he was scared for his granddaughter, and thus rejected most people who proposed to marry her. But there was one person he couldn't refuse. That was his best friend's grandson. That boy was her childhood friend, and he was a frequent visitor in their house. So when he proposed to her in front of the whole family, the grandpa had no choice but to accept it. She, the aunt, was 15 at the time. Everything proceeded without any problem until the night before the marriage. The bride sat in a room with her bridesmaids, including my great-grandmother, when the incident occurred. Suddenly, the bride's hair, which was tied in a traditional way, we call it kopoa, but I don't know the exact English, became extremely hard and her head started hurting. No one knew what was going on except the grandfather. His worst nightmare became reality. The hair stayed like that the whole night. Some other paranormal incidents also occurred that night. That night, the grandfather saw the same man in his dream. This time, he was furious and warned him to never make that mistake again or the consequences would be bad. The next day, her hair became normal again, but the marriage was canceled. The boy was no longer allowed in their house, until the grandfather passed away 3 years later. After that, the boy started visiting them again, and slowly everyone forgot the grandfather's warning. 5 years after that incident, the marriage happened again. This time, nothing paranormal happened. The groom was dressed in white traditional Shawani. His face was glowing with happiness. Unfortunately, that happiness was not for long. That night, the bride was in her room talking with her friends and sisters. Suddenly, the windows and the gates of the house started shaking violently, and loud screams could be heard from outside. A terrible stench started coming from the bride's room. Everyone came out except the bride, who was crying in there. The groom realized his mistake and took permission from the father before entering the room. Suddenly, the door closed behind him, and both of them got locked inside. It took 3 to 4 hours to break the gate from outside. When the family finally got inside, what they saw shook them to their core. The room was stained with blood. The bride was missing, and the groom was lying on the floor. His head was twisted to the opposite side, his eyes were popped out, and his skin was pale. The beautiful white sherwani was stained with blood. On the chair there was a small bag. Inside it there was 1 gold coin. It was the price for the bride. The father spent day and night trying to find the girl, but they couldn't find her. In the end, they had no choice but to accept that she was gone. The bag was put in an iron chest and locked before being buried underground. They considered it their daughter's grave. 3 years later, the father had a dream where that man told him that his daughter was alive and happy. They also had 2 children together. And the bag was a treasure which will give you 1 gold coin each time you put your hand in it. The father never checked if what he said was true or not, as nothing could make up for the loss of his daughter. Today that house is nothing but an abandoned haunted house filled with ghost stories. We call it Babur Bari, meaning Master's House. That was the first haunted incident in that house. It's actually pretty close to my cousin's house where we go during vacations. Maybe that chest is still there somewhere, but we'll never know. Encountering a Mimic by Kelsiri. I, 36 and female, live with my daughter Olivia, 16 and female, in a small town in South Dakota. She goes with her father every weekend. She leaves every Friday afternoon and comes back Sunday evenings, so usually she'll be gone by the time I get home from work on Friday evenings. This particular Friday, when I pulled up to our driveway, I looked up at her window and noticed her bedroom light was still on. I figured she accidentally left it on before leaving. I walked into the house and heard movement coming from upstairs. "Oh, she's still home," I whispered to myself. I went upstairs and knocked on her bedroom door and slowly opened it. "Your dad isn't picking you up this weekend?" I asked. "No, I told him I want to stay," she said while looking down at her journal. "Great. I'll make dinner for us and we can watch a movie if you'd like." There was a long pause before she said yes. I closed her door and I thought she was acting a bit standoffish. She usually has a lot to say. I texted her dad, asking if they maybe got into some sort of disagreement or argument that led her to not wanting to go with him this weekend. I went downstairs and started making dinner for us. As the food was cooking, I started organizing things around the house, and I noticed Olivia's book bag and coat weren't hung where we usually hang our things when we get home. I thought maybe she just took her things up to her room. No biggie. I went into the living room and saw Olivia sitting on the couch facing away from me. I didn't even hear her coming down the stairs. She kind of startled me, especially because she was just sitting there, not on her phone like usual, and the TV was off. I walked over to the kitchen and checked on the food. I yelled out to ask her to pick out a movie for us. I went out to check what movie she picked, and to my surprise, the TV was still off, and she was still sitting there, motionless. "Olivia, you didn't hear me?" I said. I grabbed the remote and picked out a movie. I chose The Conjuring. I love Vera Farmiga. I grabbed our plates, and as I sat down on the couch, I heard a notification coming from my phone in the kitchen. I told her I'd be right back. I checked my phone, and it was a text from her father. After reading his message, my body went cold and stiff, literal chills. He said, "What do you mean? I picked Olivia up from school, and we're grabbing dinner with her grandma right now." I felt catatonic at this point. I took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the living room, peeking in to see if it was still just sitting on the couch. It was. It was just sitting there, very still, looking forward but away from me. I hadn't even seen Olivia's face since I'd been home, like the thing had purposely been avoiding eye contact. I went back into the kitchen. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. I had to go back out there. My car keys were in the living room. I took a deep breath and got the courage to walk out confidently like everything was normal. It was gone. I don't know why I yelled out. "Olivia!" My stupid, confused human instincts. I heard its voice coming from upstairs, sounding just like my Olivia. It said, "Mom, I'm upstairs. I need your help," in the most sinister voice. Hell no. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house. I was shaking so much I couldn't even put the damn keys in the ignition. God, I wished I had a push start just for this very moment. As I reversed out of my driveway, I looked up at the house, and it was at Olivia's window, waving at me, faceless. I couldn't even breathe. I never drove off so fast in all my life. The Worst Hotel Experience I've Ever Had, by Small Cycle 940. Earlier this year, I stayed at the Doubletree by Hilton in Kingston upon Thames, London, for a business trip. I chose the hotel for its proximity to meetings, but I vowed never to return. The first 3 days were normal. I attended meetings and explored town. I didn't notice anything unusual until the 4th day. I felt like someone watched me as I walked to my room, and I heard faint sounds outside my door, like footsteps pausing before moving on. On the 4th day, I found a printed note under my door with the Doubletree logo. It said, "Want to skip the wait? Order room service online. Scan this QR code to get started." I scanned the QR code and went to a professional-looking website. It had the Doubletree logo, a menu, and a login page. I logged in using my Hilton Honors account and ordered a sandwich and a drink. The website said my order would arrive in 20 minutes, but an hour later, nothing came. I called the front desk, but they said no order had been placed. I checked the website again and couldn't figure out what went wrong. Frustrated, I decided to have dinner elsewhere, thinking it was just a technical glitch. That night, I noticed someone slouched against the hallway wall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low. He seemed to be scrolling on his phone, but his eyes met mine as I passed. When I reached my door, he stared directly at me. I froze, feeling uneasy, but convinced he was just another guest. I unlocked and locked my door, but the encounter left me on edge. The next morning, a cold draft brushed my face. The balcony door was slightly open, though I had locked it. My stomach dropped. I shut the door, checked the room, and told myself it was an oversight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next afternoon, the man was sitting in the hallway, closer to my door. He didn't look up, but I felt tension. I quickly entered my room, realizing he'd been outside for at least 2 days. That night, things escalated. I went to bed early, exhausted. Midnight, I heard a faint click, like a door unlocking. I held my breath, listening. Silence followed, then soft, deliberate footsteps inside my room. Panic surged through me as I froze, barely breathing, as footsteps approached. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the situation. A presence loomed at my bed's foot. I cracked my eyes to see the man from the hallway, his phone screen illuminating him as he took pictures. My heart pounded, fearing he'd hear it. He'd entered my room using the fake room service website, stealing my Hilton Honors login information to access the mobile key feature. He stood less than 2 feet away, and I was helpless. He snapped another picture before turning and walking toward the door. As it clicked shut, I called the police, my hands shaking. They arrived quickly, but couldn't find him. Hotel security confirmed he'd entered using the mobile key feature, but couldn't explain how he'd gained access. They also showed me footage of him loitering outside my room daily at 3 p.m. He was arrested 2 weeks later for an unrelated incident. The most chilling part? Police found dozens of pictures of me and others from inside my room and around the hotel on his phone. He'd been stalking me, watching my every move. I checked out the next morning and haven't stayed in a hotel since. The thought of someone watching me while I slept is a nightmare I can't escape. My Experience as a Park Ranger in the Southern U.S. by Pine Devil. So this story is weird, not because of the contents, but because the settings sound like something from a bad cliché skinwalker story. But regardless, it isn't the typical story. I hope you enjoy it. I was a park ranger in the southern U.S. My park was known for its caverns and its springs that made for excellent fishing. I began my work there as a tour guide and a groundskeeper. This would often culminate in me taking people on cave tours and helping people find their way on hiking trails. The weird stuff started in the month of October, when, during the routine maintenance of the cave's lighting system, you would feel eyes on you. You could even sometimes hear the sound of feet slapping the wet floor occasionally. I really didn't enjoy having to change the light bulbs for that reason. That being said, there was a phenomenon that when you would be closing up the museum and gift shop for the night, you would hear voices. A few times, it would sound like guests, which I could explain away. But during one night, I could hear someone speaking on the second story of the museum. Kind of irritated, I walked up there to let the guests know that the park was shutting down for the night and that they would have to head back to the campgrounds. However, it was pitch black the moment I got up the stairs, and I couldn't hear anyone anymore as I made my way through the museum and toward its balcony area. The moment I crossed the threshold, I heard something hit the trees outside and tear off through the underbrush. I don't know about this, though. It could have been a raccoon or something, but it was certainly odd. Many times walking through the trails from base to other resting points and ranger huts, you would sometimes hear this meow that just sounded off. It sounded off because it was a weird Chinese motion sensor we had in the ranger station to let others know if someone was trying to sneak in and steal things during park hours. The strange part is that this meow would be heard just in the tree line and literally miles from my station. Keep in mind that no other stations had this motion sensor, and it was a running joke with other stations about how awful this motion sensor was. It was bizarre, and the sound would move around you in circles as you hiked. During the rainy season, it seemed to get worse. I suppose when the caves would flood and push whatever thing was living in the deeper, unexplored parts out into the tourist areas. I would often hear other rangers' voices from the areas that were closed off for flooding. These areas were literally inaccessible because of 10 or so feet of water. On one occasion, as I was leading my tour through these caves, I heard a very close friend of mine ask me, "Hey, would you mind coming over here and helping me?" from a closed-off area. The room was dark, half-flooded, and it seemed that even the people on the tour knew that. I could see the color leave their faces. We had explained to people thoroughly that some areas were literally inaccessible due to flooding beforehand. Against my better judgment, I left my group. I made sure the lights were bright. I went in and swept the light around, but when I say this room is massive, I mean it. The largest in the tour cave. I heard one slosh, and that was just about all I could justify being around for. The water was dark and cold, and the room was so vast my terrible mag light was being eaten by the dark. I made the rest of my tour fast and got back to the surface, went back to the ranger station, and asked them where my coworker was. The receptionist casually told me that he'd clocked out about an hour ago, before my tour even began. Another notable experience was when I had to go down the crawl space of the museum once more to get weed whacker string. I was sitting there in this musty cobblestone basement that spanned under this 1800s massive building with a dirt floor and multiple stone columns running the length of the crawl space. I was trying to untangle this weed whacker string when I heard someone from further in the basement do the cliché, "Psst." Weirdly enough, I guess I hadn't put it together yet, so I spoke back. "What do you need?" Somehow thinking it was a coworker or something. "Come back here." It was possibly the creepiest thing I have ever heard. I'm not going to give you the "something sounded off and I can't explain it" spill. The reason it sounded off was because it sounded like the way crows will mimic people's speech, that low, weirdly chortling way they sound. I couldn't see what was talking to me, so I simply grabbed my weed whacker string and hurried out of the crawl space door. Shutting it behind me definitely had that feeling of something rushing up behind before I locked the door. Some weird, possibly related things were that when I asked a senior ranger about it, he said, "Don't worry about it, it happens." We also had a weird string of finding empty baby carriages and clothes up in the trees or at the bottom of gulches, and a man that claimed he saw a mermaid in one of the local springs. Another man insisted on cornering me and screaming at me that the devil lived in the caves. There were also a metric ton of caves in the park that were still active and we didn't take tours through, one of which I heard rumors about that apparently had crabs and other little microbes in it from prehistoric times. I learned this when I eavesdropped on 2 university people talking to a senior. One cave that the local teens made out in had a massive drop-off into a sinkhole, rumored to be where Confederate gold was hidden. Another had a ton of pottery and arrowheads in it, which was very interesting from an anthropology standpoint. These were weird times in my life. The park, while I won't name it, had a wonderful vibe of mystery and wonder to it, although a few years later, half of the staff was laid off for selling native pottery and stuff illegally. So as you can imagine, I'm glad I moved on in time to avoid that garbage. I'm not necessarily trying to convince anyone of anything, just sharing some weird experiences. I hope you enjoy them. On the Other Side of the Treehouse Door by Ozzy Osbourne. When I was around 9 years old, my parents built me and my twin brother a treehouse. We lived in a very rural town in Washington State on 5 acres of land. The house and lawns took up about 2 acres of land, and the other 3 acres were woods. The treehouse sat in the middle of these woods and was hidden away from the trails inside the woods. It was a basic treehouse, nothing too fancy, but to my brother and I, it was the coolest thing in the world. We always wanted to sleep in the treehouse, but because it was in the thick woods quite a ways from the house, my parents said no. When we were 11 years old, they finally said yes after we kept begging them. My brother and I gathered up some comic books, our Nintendo DS's, flashlights, and sleeping bags, and headed out to the treehouse after dinner. Washington summer evenings are pretty comfortable, so we weren't too worried about getting cold and were more focused on having fun in the treehouse. We set up our sleeping bags in there and then began playing Pokemon on our DS's and having a good time. As it started getting darker, we switched on our flashlights and read our comic books. The treehouse door had 2 latches to keep the door shut when it got windy. One latch on the outside and one on the inside. As we got into our sleeping bags, I secured the inside latch so the door wouldn't blow open in the middle of the night. I don't remember what time it was, but I woke up to the sound of crunching on the ground below us. I sat up and listened to my surroundings, making sure I wasn't hearing things. I kept hearing the crunching below the treehouse. I woke my brother up and whispered that I heard crunching. He reached for his flashlight, but I stopped him. We sat in the pitch dark, listening. It seemed that the noise had stopped. He whispered back that it was probably coyotes and that we were fine. Not 30 seconds later, we heard the ladder to the treehouse creak with the weight of someone climbing up. Then they tried to push the door open, but luckily the latch was set and the door stayed closed. A huge thud came from the other side of the door, along with the sounds of cracking wood. We stayed quiet, too scared to make a sound. The next sound we heard was a thump on the ground that sounded like someone jumping off the last bit of the ladder and footsteps walking away. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we got the courage to bolt back to the house. We left everything but the DSs. Even though we were scared out of our minds, we both wanted to make sure our DSs were safe, especially since I had finally caught Polkia and my brother caught Dialga. We made it back to the house in 2 minutes, running the fastest we had ever run before. The walk to the treehouse takes about 5 minutes from the back door, so the run back in 2 minutes was impressive for us. We grabbed the key under the pot and opened the back door, locking it behind us. We both went into our room, finally feeling safe. We didn't want to tell our parents what had happened because we didn't want Mom to say, "I told you so," and not allow us back out there. The next week, as we were in the post office with our mom, our neighbor who lived down the road from us walked in. As my mom and the neighbor got to talking, he told her that last week he found a very thin, greasy, disheveled man in his shed. My neighbor's dog had apparently seen the man go into the shed and was barking at the shed. When my neighbor went to go check it out, he found the man in there, holding a rusty old knife. Luckily, my neighbor had brought out his hunting rifle to check it out, and the man dropped the knife. The cops were called, and the man was taken away. I believe that the disheveled man was who was on the other side of the treehouse door, looking for a place to sleep that night. After that incident, we didn't play at the treehouse as much, and only went into those woods when it was light out, and we always took a knife with us from that point on. The creepiest coincidence I've personally experienced. I was a young guy in college, driving back to campus from somewhere when I ran out of gas. It was getting dark, maybe 6 or 7 p.m. When I realized the gas ran out, I turned off the main street. Then, with my car's remaining momentum, I glided until I stopped in front of some random house. I sat in the car trying to think if there was anyone else I knew with a car who stayed on campus for the winter break. No dice. So then I resigned myself to the fact that I needed to walk to wherever the nearest gas station was, fill up the little gas can from my trunk, and then walk back. I went and grabbed the canister, and before I walked, I leaned on the front of my car and looked up directions. Just then, a woman pulled into the driveway. She was also college age, wearing some sort of server's outfit, like she worked in fast food. I was parked right out in front of her house when she noticed me. She came up, a little hesitant, and asked if I needed help. I said, "Honestly, yeah, I ran out of gas, and it says here we're kind of a far walk from the Chevron." She looked at me like she had seen a ghost. At first I chalked it up to it getting late, me being a guy, and her trying to gauge if I was messing with her. But it really struck me how afraid she suddenly looked. I tried to assure her I had the gas can, and I didn't need to go with her or anything, and I could pay for it. She took the can, but refused any money. I waited there for a while. She came back, handed me the canister, and then stood there for a second. I could tell she was deciding whether or not to say something. Then she just straight out asked, "Do you want to hear something weird?" Of course I said yes. She said, "Today at work I got this prank call. But it was a weird prank call in that all it was just the guy on the other line kept asking me over and over, 'Have you ever ran out of gas?' After she told me, we both just kind of chuckled, not really knowing what to say except thanks and take care. It genuinely gives me chills every time I think about it. The reappearing ring. This happened a few years ago, and has become so infamous in mine and my husband's relationship because it legitimately freaks my husband out to the point where we can't even talk about it besides referring to it as the ring. One Saturday morning, I was finishing up getting ready for work and went to go put my everyday jewelry on, wedding ring, college class ring, and watch, when I realized my college ring was missing from its usual home on my nightstand. This was a very special and sentimental item to me, so I was a little panicked when I couldn't find it after a few minutes. I called my husband in to help me look for it, and we proceeded to turn the house upside down for it. He double-checked everywhere I looked, and we scoured both our bedroom and the rest of the house for it, to no avail. I was starting to run out of time to make it to work, so I had to leave without finding it. I returned home after my 8-hour shift, proceeded to drop my bag at the door, and headed straight to the bedroom to change clothes. The second I walked in the bedroom, I saw my ring. It was sitting right on my nightstand, in perfect plain view. I got so excited and assumed my husband had found it for me while I was gone and had placed it there. I figured he was trying to surprise me with it since he didn't text me to let me know he found it, so I sat on the bed and waited for him to walk in the room so I could thank him. As soon as he walked in the room, I excitedly exclaimed, "You found it!" He stared at me with a confused look and said, "What are you talking about?" I pointed to the ring, still on my nightstand, and said, "My ring! You found it! Where was it?" He got an even more confused look on his face and said, "I didn't find it. Where did you find it?" I started rolling my eyes at this point, thinking he was messing with me, and said something like, "Oh, come on, where was it?" We went back and forth for a while over who found the ring until I realized my husband actually wasn't kidding at all. He was genuinely confused and thought I was messing with him. His face became more and more serious, and we both stared at each other, understanding that neither of us had actually found it. My husband, a man of science, began going over every possibility of how I could have found it when I got home, placed it on my nightstand, and then forgot I did all of that. I explained to him I had left the house without either of us finding it, literally hadn't been home all day, and had just returned less than 15 minutes ago, where I hadn't done anything except drop my bag and walk into the bedroom, where it was sitting there waiting for me. To this day, we don't have a single possible explanation for it. He refuses to believe anything other than the idea that I somehow found it and then immediately forgot I did that, which is absolutely impossible. How could I completely forget both finding it and placing it on my nightstand? There's no way. But he refuses to believe in ghosts or anything that doesn't have a rational explanation, and I don't have a single other logical possibility for its return. It's been years, and we still can't talk about it without getting completely spooked about the whole thing. And while I don't have a rational explanation, I do have a wishful thinking one. My grandpa, my hero, had passed away a month before. Was he looking out for me? I'll never know.